All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to our latest explainer. Today, we are unpacking a totally fascinating Supreme Court reversal. I mean, this one really flips how we think about government accountability, criminal liability, and honestly, the whole concept of intent. We're looking at the 2024 Supreme Court resolution for People of the Philippines versus Antonio M. Talawe. If you're a fan of legal plot twists and really sharp logic, you're going to love this. We're breaking down how a public official went from facing a literal lifetime ban from public office to total exoneration. And it all happened because the highest court in the land took a second, much harder look at one specific legal definition. So, to set the stage here, think about this central question. If a municipality completely fails to pay its debts, is the mayor automatically guilty of a crime? It's a super tempting assumption, right? The buck stops at the top. The mayor is the chief executive. So if the local government unit totally messes up a major financial obligation, it seems kind of obvious that the person in charge should face the music. But as we're going to see in this case study today, the justice system actually requires a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, when deciding who goes to prison. Just take a look at the sheer scale of the problem we're dealing with. Over 22.4 million Filipino pesos. That is a massive amount of money. It's the aggregate total of unremitted GSIS, that's the Government Service Insurance System, employee premium contributions that the municipality of Sto Tomas in Isabela failed to pay between January 1997 and January 2004. So for years, the municipality was deducting these premiums from its employees' salaries, but then just failing to turn that money over to the GSIS. And look, when millions of pesos go missing from a government insurance fund, somebody has to answer for it. Well, that somebody ended up being Mayor Antonio M. Talawe, and the real-world stakes for the mayor here were absolutely incredibly high. Back in 2019, the Sandigan Bayan, which is the special appellate collegial court in the Philippines that handles graft and corruption cases, actually convicted him. They sentenced him to anywhere from 3 to 5 years in prison, but honestly, perhaps even more devastating for a career politician, the conviction carried the accessory penalty of absolute perpetual disqualification from holding public office. Basically, his career was over and his freedom was completely on the line. Let's quickly walk through the timeline, because this was definitely not an overnight process. The unpaid premiums stretched from 1997 all the way to 2004. Fast forward to 2019, and the Sandigan Bayan hands down its conviction. The mayor appeals to the Supreme Court, but get this. In 2021, the Supreme Court actually denied his appeal and upheld the conviction. So for years, this guilty verdict seemed totally set in stone. It wasn't until a motion for reconsideration in 2024 that the Supreme Court released a new resolution, completely reversing their 2021 decision and acquitting him. To understand how a seemingly locked-in conviction got completely thrown out, we've got to look at the legal mechanics used to convict him in the first place. This brings us to Section 1, the legal trap, and the concept of strict liability. The whole foundation of this trap revolves around a concept called malum prohibitum. In criminal law, offenses are basically divided into two camps. You have mala and se, which are things that are inherently wrong or evil, like murder or theft. And then you have mala prohibita, things that are wrong simply because a law says they're wrong. Under the GSIS Act of 1997, failing to remit premium contributions within 30 days is explicitly penalized. It is malum prohibitum. The law literally does not care if the mayor intended to steal the money or if he was acting with some kind of malice. The simple fact that the act happened, or in this case, the remittance was delayed, makes it a crime. You can see exactly how the Sandigan Bayan cornered him with this quote from their decision. The non-remittance of the GSIS premium contributions is malum prohibitum. Talawe cannot hide. They used this strict classification to essentially say, look, we don't need to hear your excuses. We don't care if you were trying to fix the problem in good faith. The premiums weren't paid on time. The law says that's a crime. End of story. It's an incredibly rigid, black and white application of the law. But here's the crucial thing you've got to take away from this dynamic. There is a massive misconception out there, honestly, even among legal observers, that if a crime is malum prohibitum, strict liability leaves absolutely zero room for context. People just assume that strict liability means you can be convicted even if you were entirely passive, maybe a victim of circumstance, or genuinely trying to comply but got blocked by administrative hurdles. And that exact assumption is what the Supreme Court set out to correct in 2024. Which leads us right into Section 2, the nuance, taking a second hard look at the facts. Okay, this right here, this is the absolute core of the entire reversal. For a malum prohibitum crime, the prosecution does not need to prove you had an evil criminal intent. However, and this is a huge however, they absolutely must prove volition. That means they have to prove you consciously and voluntarily chose to perpetrate the prohibited act. You can't just throw out the need for volition just because a crime happens to be malum prohibitum. So that completely prompts us to reevaluate the entire case through this new, highly specific lens. Did Mayor Talal actually have the volition to withhold those premiums? Like, did he consciously direct his staff not to pay the GSIS? Or was the non-payment the result of something totally outside his active, conscious intent? All of a sudden, the mayor's context and what he was actually doing behind the scenes matters a whole lot. Let's move on to Section 3, Evidence and Acquittal, and see how to negate volition. Well, when the court actually looked closely, Mayor Talawi's actions completely negated any volition to commit this crime. First off, the evidence showed he genuinely believed the Department of Budget and Management had already withheld 5 million pesos from the municipality's budget to cover those 1997 premiums. Now, it was a mistaken belief, sure, but it shows he definitely wasn't intending to skip the bill. Second, the second he realized the mess, he actively instructed his municipal treasurer to reconcile the accounts with GSIS. Third, and this is probably the most important part, he was the one who initiated and signed a memorandum of agreement in 2008 with the GSIS to restructure that massive debt into a loan so it could be paid off in installments. He even defended the municipality in court when GSIS sued them civilly. I mean, none of these are the actions of a guy who consciously and voluntarily intended to break the law. He was literally trying to fix an administrative nightmare. And then comes this secondary twist that just totally dismantled the prosecution's case. The Supreme Court pointed out that the prosecution actually failed to prove the mayor even had the explicit positive duty to remit the premiums in the first place. The Local Government Code of 1991 outlines the duties of a mayor, right? But nowhere in that code does it actually say the mayor is the specific person mandated to calculate and remit GSIS premiums. The law refers to mayors as chief executives, not the heads of offices who are specifically tasked with this administrative remittance function. So actually, scratch that. Not only did he lack the volition to withhold the money, he arguably wasn't even the guy legally required to push the pay button. So let's trace the logical progression that ultimately saved the mayor. Step 1. The Supreme Court reevaluates the standard, clearly asserting that malum prohibitum still requires volition. Step 2. They look at the mayor's overt actions, the MOA, the instructions to the treasurer, and find that there is absolutely reasonable doubt that he intended to cause the non-remittance. And finally, step 3, because the prosecution failed to prove volition beyond a reasonable doubt, the conviction is entirely reversed and Mayor Talawi gets completely acquitted. This really highlights the incredibly high bar set by our justice system. The Supreme Court wrote, "The evidence must establish the truth of the fact to a reasonable and moral certainty, a certainty that convinces and directs the understanding." It is simply not enough for a prosecutor to just say, "Hey, the bill wasn't paid and you're the mayor, so go to jail." No way. They have to prove to a moral certainty that you actively perpetrated the act. That high bar of reasonable doubt is exactly what shielded this mayor from a wrongful lifetime ban on holding public office. Finally, we arrive at Section 4, the takeaway, and the real-world impact of this decision. So what should you really take away from all this? Basically, that government accountability requires absolute precision. Look, we all want corrupt or negligent officials to face the music, right? For sure. But this case proves that the justice system has to carefully distinguish between administrative messes, which this clearly was, and deliberate, conscious criminal acts. Strict liability laws exist to ensure compliance, yes, absolutely, but they cannot be used as some kind of blunt instrument to blindly ignore a public official's actual volition and their good faith efforts to solve inherited systemic financial problems. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought. The next time you're scrolling on your phone and you see a headline about a top public official being convicted for some bureaucratic or financial failure in their department, are you going to ask if they actually had the volition to commit the act? Or did they just have the sheer misfortune of being the person sitting in the biggest chair when the administrative music stopped? It really changes how you read the news, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep asking those hard questions.